Well, I think that, all of our presenters today, I think have inspired me so much, and hopefully they've inspired the rest of the group in terms of both what's possible and some best practices from beyond the region, but also some things that are already starting to happen here. So at this point, I would love to invite Sarah, Vincent, and Hana to bring their videos back on, and we'll join each other here for a discussion. Thank you all so much for your presentations and for sharing your expertise today. I think what I want to do is sort of, with the time we have left, I want to weave together my questions for you to discuss as a panel, but then I'm also going to loop in a couple of the questions from the audience too. So for our audience members who've put questions in the chat, I'll invite you to ask those out loud too. So, but I'll get us kicked off here. So there were so many things that I appreciated about the presentations today. And the first question kind of goes to something that you were presenting on at the beginning, Hana. So I really appreciated that when you pulled us through each case study, you talked about equity in the mission, the process, the outcomes, and the measurement. And I think that's a really important combination. And so kind of going back to the idea of outcomes, and any of you can volunteer to take this if you'd like to answer it, but how do we, based on all of the wonderful ideas that we've heard and the great examples, to Vincent's comment that it's really imperative that we make the right decisions now, how do we keep ourselves accountable to better achieve equitable outcomes? Does anybody want to take that?
Holiday Inn Express Hotel and Suites, PA. Located I-90 exit 41, easy access from freeway. Staying with us opens the door.
Okay, I've muted everybody just to be sure. Okay, so the three of you can unmute again if you want.
I'm happy to start with that. I think it's so important that the intended outcomes are meeting the community needs, which I always just keep going back to. And so that really starts with ensuring that at first the mission of the program is responsive to community needs. And that way you can actually track if those outcomes are the right outcomes. You can have all these amazing outcomes, but they could be completely off track from what people say they want. So I think it's just, again, always making sure it ties back to community identified needs.
Exactly. And if I could, to further that the outcomes and that the things you're measuring are of real value, that they're not these technical proxies for some outcome that nobody really cares about or that isn't really relevant to that community, that you're, to Hana's point, that you're working with community to figure out what those societal outcomes are at a very granular level.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, starting at the beginning and then pulling those identified needs all the way through. That's great. Thank you. Andrea, you had a question about rentals, I think. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. I was just curious. It's easier to think about how one would have a charging infrastructure at home if they own their own home. But if we're also looking at trying to make sure that electric vehicles get into the hands of people who might not own their own houses, then how do we make sure that they're able to charge their cars in the home they rent?
Yeah, I have some examples, ideas for that. Myself, Hana might have some other ideas from what you guys have been seeing in California. I think, well, three things come to mind quickly. One is outreach to the property owners and the landlords in these situations to help them understand the attractiveness and the interest of their tenants and their potential tenants. That this is something that they would like to see in their homes. I think that's something that's an education piece. The second thing is that electric vehicles can charge with what is called level 1, which is a regular wall outlet. In many cases, EV drivers don't need, they'll tell us they don't need a fancy, $500+ level 2 charging station. While it does charge faster, they get the charge that they need overnight with level 1. It's just a regular wall outlet. The third thing is that this highlights the importance. While most people do charge their vehicle most of the time and gets most of their needs at their homes, this highlights the importance for public charging and charging infrastructure at multi-unit dwellings. where there is not an individual homeowner who is going to be responsible for installing that charging station and that sort of thing. But that's why there's that bigger need to think outside the individual single family dwelling homeowner.
Are there other places that are doing curbside charging? Well,
yeah, you know, our friends at DOMI at the city and then the resilience office, this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about, pilot activities. I know that Chris Sandvig has also been interested in it. It's a tricky one and probably one that could use its own whole Inspire speaker series to talk about the cracking of the nut there on that one. But I think that there's some really interesting ways that we can work together to try to start some pilot activity. But it is complex, but there are some communities that we can learn from, and that's what we're looking to.
thank you.
It's a great question. Does any other speaker want to weigh in on that? That was really good information, Sarah. Thank you. Lisa Kay, you just popped a really interesting question into the chat. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Sure. I was just wondering about the impact of the pandemic and many jobs being moved to remote, not all, but some of them, and that many of those jobs are probably going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. So how are we planning for this kind of new mobility pattern that we're seeing, and how do we incorporate that into longer range plans? And how do we look at what the opportunities are for transportation and resource needs as they shift?
If I can take that or try to anyway, great question, Lisa Kay. We here at SPC have started a process where, well, as all of you know, MPOs are responsible for the TIP, or the Transportation Improvement Program, and it's a well-established way of creating at least a convening or a table for talking about transportation needs in a given region. Our thinking was that, number one, as was kind of embedded in my presentation, connectivity is a new transportation mode. It's a way of providing access. And number two, since we already know how to do the TIP process, that we could transfer that skill set and that knowledge to what we call a connectivity improvement program or a CIP program. And that when you convene that table, assuming that you're using kind of the same approach that you've used in transportation, you can start to develop the Venn diagram, the commonality of connectivity needs in a given region. Allegheny County is going to have very different needs than Armstrong or than Indiana. No less valid, but certainly different. And so if you create a space whereby everyone's talking and you have that overlap in the Venn diagram, that's where you can start thinking about providing connectivity. For some, it's going to be about providing access to education in schools. For others, it's going to be about economic development. For others, it's going to be about job training, providing all of these things in a virtual space. None of them more important than the other, but each of them valid in their own way. And so how we do the planning around that kind of really talks about then how we spend our money and really parsing it out. What do we do first? Because you can't do everything at the same time.
Thank you. Any of our other speakers want to answer that question too? That was great. Thank you. Okay, Lisa Barber, you had a couple of good questions. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hi.
I guess maybe my second one, I'm just curious because I know sometimes that government funding is actually tied to like the ridership numbers. And now with those numbers like dropping so significantly during COVID, I'm just curious about, if that is going to further compromise, maybe the service for the disadvantaged communities. I'm just
I
curious
would just
too
say-
about like the newer, funding that might be coming down the pike.
Yeah, I mean, really because of the chronic underfunding of public transit, we've had to increasingly rely on fares for funding. But we know this is not equitable. We know it's not sustainable. We have really learned that lesson during the pandemic when there's a drop in ridership. And we know who suffers the most in those cases, transit dependent people. But I think with this new federal infrastructure bill, which I'm over the moon about, so excited about it, I would love to see this as an opportunity to restructure the way that we fund public transit, not just in one bill, but in just the long term, how we should restructure the formulas which allocate funding to public transit, maybe not based on ridership, but based on where the need is greatest, and how can we use this as a way to attract more riders, even if in this future where more people are working remotely, it shouldn't be necessarily about it should be about the quality of the public transit as opposed to ridership.
Hana couldn't have said it any better. As a former FTA insider and an associate administrator for research, let me give you kind of a sense as to the disparity. I had a $25 million program for research. The comparable program in federal highways was $500 million. So you can start to see the imbalance there. Our program was a $15 billion program compared to multiple more billions for federal highways. Again, it's not a complaint against the folks at federal highways. There are some wonderful people there. It was a function of what authorization said. It was a function of the structure at the federal level. And to Hana's point, my dearest wish would be that we think about what we're measuring and doing it so that we're reflecting real need and real community choice. The people who would counter argue that always said, well, public transportation is only 2% of all rides in the United States. And that's, again, one of those false metrics. Again, you're not valuing the actual mobility. What does that mobility provide in terms of equity, access, and all the other societal benefits that we're looking for. So again, maybe, hopefully the federal space will see a way to measuring the value of public transportation in a different and better way.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. This is great conversation. We've got 3 minutes left, so I really want to let Chris ask his question. Chris Sandvig, if you want to unmute yourself, you can have the last question. Hi.
Thanks. I appreciate that. It's good to see you all, Hana. I hope we get to catch up. And it was partly answered, but I do want to ask, is this conversation starting to happen, at least at some level, within public agencies that are responsible for the funding? Because the funding runs at complete cross purposes, much like Hana had mentioned. And I think Bill Washington from LA Metro has said, from what people want to see in this system, which is to be treated more like a utility or like the post office and less like, UPS for people, basically. So are there discussions at least starting to happen beyond, transit agencies into those who are responsible for the purse strings and that sort of thing about looking at this differently and it being okay that that bus comes down the street with one person in it at 2 in the afternoon so that the service is there for people who need it?
Oh, Chris, I can't speak for DC, but I do know that there are reauthorization discussions going on right now, and they are talking about a complete change in the way the funding is allocated. I don't know if it'll see light of day, but I'm heartened by the fact that the discussions are going on. Now, as to the one bus going down the street with one person and a driver, and maybe the solution there is, right sizing the vehicle at the right time and providing more efficient service that way. Again, cutting off the critics, cutting off the conversations of the critics who point as that as being a publicly subsidized limousine.
Right tool for the job, I think, as Hana said earlier. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that question, Chris. Anybody else want to comment on that? Well, wow, we really had, I think, such a great, great group of presenters here and wonderful conversation. So I want to thank our speakers, Hana, Vincent, and Sarah. And I really want to thank our participants too, bringing your own perspectives to the chat in terms of your vision of equitable mobility and your fantastic questions. So I know a lot of folks are already connecting in the chat too, which I think is great. And Hana, thank you for joining us from California. If it's okay with you, I'll share the report with everybody after. I know that everyone will be interested in seeing that. And we just appreciate everyone being with us today. So thank you so much again, and I'll look forward to seeing you all again soon.